A motel clerk disappears, leaving behind a trail of blood. Investigators have their suspect, but without a victim, what can they charge him with? A shooting is reported, but investigators have no proof that it really occurred. Until they can sift fact from fiction, they haven't got a case. Is a missing sofa the key to a woman's disappearance? The prosecution can't rest until it can make sense of a series of odd clues. Murder is usually the most obvious of crimes. The victims' bodies mute witnesses to violence. But their silent testimony may go unheard when they disappear without a trace. Memphis, Tennessee, a thriving southern city. Home of Beale Street, the Blues, and Elvis Presley. But in 1997, it played host to a deadly mystery. In the early morning hours of February 8th, a man arrived at a Memphis motel. He became concerned when calls to the front desk went unanswered. He went to check it out.
Hello?
The clerk appeared to be missing.
Hello?
He didn't see anyone in the lobby, but there was blood on the counter. The office security door was open, and he noticed more blood on the frame. Convinced something was wrong, he left and called police. When Memphis police arrived, they discovered blood outside the motel entrance. Smearing indicated something had been dragged across the pavement. They found more clues inside. While the office showed no sign of forced entry, the cash register was open and empty. But a purse lying undisturbed nearby caught their attention. They didn't believe a woman would willingly leave it behind. The wallet inside still contained money, as well as a checkbook, credit cards, and driver's license in the name of Ricky Ellsworth. Alerted by police, the motel manager arrived and confirmed that Ricky Ellsworth was the clerk on duty. She said Ricky lived nearby with her husband, Don, and 2 children. A trusted, reliable employee, she wasn't the sort to just leave in the middle of her shift. Circumstances of the crime suggested more than robbery. Police suspected the clerk had been abducted. As police processed the scene, other significant details began to emerge. The office security door was equipped with a keypad, but it was open and showed no sign of tampering. Either someone had known the code or the clerk had unlocked the door. To investigators, that suggested Ricky Ellsworth might have known her abductor.
So fingerprints, those are going to be fingerprints.
Although police had begun to suspect foul play, nothing prepared them for what they found in an adjacent bathroom. There were signs of a desperate struggle and much more blood. The running sink contained a small flashlight, and the toilet seat had been ripped from its hinges. Wet, blood-tinged sheets indicated someone had tried to clean the room. Not only had Ricky Ellsworth disappeared, but it now seemed she'd been seriously injured. Captain R.G. Moore, who led the crime scene unit, feared the worst.
When we don't have a body and we don't know exactly what happened, we'd handle it just like it's going to be a homicide case. We process the scene, we collect our blood sample, we collect all the evidence we can find from the scene, and just keep it until we see what we got.
Investigators hoped the evidence would lead them to Ricky. A squad car brought the victim's husband, Don Ellsworth, to the motel. He said he and Ricky were happily married. He told police his wife was a kind person who worked with a Christian prison ministry in her spare time. Every Christmas, she baked pies for the prisoners. But Ellsworth said their marriage hadn't always been so tranquil. They'd once separated for 2 years, and she'd gotten involved with a man who assaulted her and went to prison for it. Ellsworth said the man's name was Michael Rimmer. After finishing at the scene, the investigators returned to the station to conduct a background check on Michael Rimmer. What they found in the files was chilling. Rimmer was a high school dropout with a history of drug problems and violence. In 1989, he was convicted of robbing and brutally assaulting Ricky Ellsworth. Details of Rimmer's previous assault on Ricky raised Detective Robert Shemwell's suspicions.
His actions at that crime basically mirrored what was happening here at the motel with the cleaning up, or attempt to clean up the evidence. We immediately began looking for Michael Rimmer.
Meanwhile, detectives narrowed the time frame for Ricky's disappearance. They found a couple who had checked in with her at 1:15 a.m. But when 2 others tried to check out around 2:30, she wasn't there. Detectives located a witness who said he pulled into the motel at approximately 2:15, hoping to rent a room. But he saw a man with bloody knuckles behind the counter and left without registering. He also noticed a 4-door maroon car backed up to the curb, its trunk and doors open. Based on his description, police put together a composite of the man at the motel. Using an identikit, a collection of facial parts and features that can be assembled as needed, the suspect's face came together. It resembled Michael Rimmer. Detectives then asked the witness to look through an album of more than 50 mugshots, including Rimmer's. Their hopes were dashed when he couldn't positively identify Rimmer as the man with the bloody knuckles. Detectives learned from a co-worker that Ricky had recently gotten a birthday card from a Michael in Mississippi. She took the card into the back office to read, but became angry and threw it away.
Sir.
It was becoming clear to detectives that if they wanted to find Ricky Ellsworth, they needed to find Michael Rimmer. They started at the auto repair shop where he worked. Nobody had seen him since Friday, the day before Ricky disappeared. He'd left his tools and paycheck behind. One more critical fact emerged.
When we got to talking to the employees there, this same maroon 4-door vehicle was described as being Michael Rimmer's car. So then we decided we need to track down and find out where Michael Rimmer got this 4-door maroon vehicle.
It wasn't registered to Rimmer. If it wasn't his, detectives wondered where he'd gotten it. His co-workers sent detectives to another friend of Rimmer's who told them that his own maroon 4-door car had been stolen a month earlier, shortly after he'd last seen Rimmer. After 4 days, Ricky Ellsworth was still missing, and so was Michael Rimmer.
How you doing, sir?
Hoping for a clue to his whereabouts, police questioned his brother. Richard Rimmer said he'd last seen Michael on the morning of February 9th, just hours after Ricky Ellsworth disappeared. Michael had seemed exhausted when he arrived in the maroon car around 9:30 a.m. He asked Richard if he knew how to remove a blood stain from the back seat. Then, Michael pulled a muddy shovel from the car and scraped mud from his boots. Richard also told police that Michael claimed Ricky bought the car for him. She had visited Rimmer in prison after he claimed he'd found God. And Richard knew the two had met after his release. But somewhere along the line, the friendship soured. By now, 2 weeks had passed, and still nobody had seen or heard from Ricky Ellsworth. Detectives had lost hope of finding her alive, and their prime suspect, Michael Rimmer, still eluded them. They would have to find him and the stolen car if they had any chance of proving murder.
I issued a theft of property warrant on Michael Rimmer and indicated in that warrant that when he was located, or if that vehicle was located, that he was to be held for the Memphis Homicide Unit and processed.
Detectives got a promising lead from one of Rimmer's former cellmates. He said Rimmer spoke of killing Ricky and burying her in Mississippi after he got out of prison. Rimmer's former girlfriend told detectives of a wooded area called Plantation Point near Arca-Butler Lake in Mississippi. It was 45 minutes from Memphis. She said Rimmer liked to go there. Detectives headed to Plantation Point. They combed the area on foot, but didn't find anything. Then they called in blackwater divers from the Shelby County Search and Rescue Unit. Specially trained to operate by touch in dark, murky black water, the divers searched the lake. They didn't find anything either. Detectives were thoroughly frustrated. They chased down every witness and lead, but were no closer to solving the case or finding Ricky Ellsworth or Michael Rimmer. Now they'd run out of options. In Memphis, nearly a month had passed with no progress in the potential homicide case. In early March, detectives got a phone call from Johnson County, Indiana. A sheriff's deputy there had stopped a maroon car for speeding. When he ran a check on the license plate, he discovered the car was stolen and there was a warrant for the driver. Michael Rimmer, sought for crimes including robbery and possible murder, had been arrested during a routine traffic stop. Detectives flew to Indiana, prepared to finally question Rimmer and examine the car for evidence. After obtaining a warrant, forensic investigators with the Johnson County Crime Unit searched the car. They hoped for solid evidence, but never expected to find what they did.
Numerous receipts, hotel receipts, pawn shop receipts, restaurant receipts, showing Mike's every step from the day Ricky came up missing till his actual apprehension.
Investigators tested the stained back seat for human blood. Results were positive. It was their first physical evidence to suggest a connection between Rimmer and the crime. Memphis detectives questioned Michael Rimmer over the next 2 days. He denied stealing the car or having anything to do with Ricky's disappearance. So far, all their evidence was circumstantial. Without Ricky's body, there was only one way to link Rimmer to her murder.
The blood from the rear of the vehicle Michael Rimmer was occupying and the blood from the scene matched. We had a problem though. We had to determine or show somehow that that blood was Ricky Ellsworth's blood.
They had one chance, a reverse paternity DNA test which uses the combined DNA traits passed on from parents to determine the DNA characteristics of their children. Forensic scientists compared blood from Ricky's mother to samples from the crime scene and the maroon car. They matched. The test established a 16 million to 1 probability that blood from the car and motel came from an offspring of Ricky's mother. It was the final link police needed to prove murder. Michael Rimmer's guilt was written in blood. Based on evidence, police believe they know what happened on February 8th. Michael Rimmer drove to the motel sometime around 1:30 a.m., knowing Ricky Ellsworth would be alone. When he arrived, she let him into the office. There, Rimmer exploded into violence, attacking her, then wrapping her body in sheets. Afterward, he tried to clean the room, but gave up and left the sink running. Dragging Ricky to his car, Rimmer made his escape. Although her body was never found, police believe Ricky Ellsworth is buried somewhere near Arca Butler Lake. Michael Rimmer was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While no body was ever found in the Rimmer case, police used blood evidence to prove murder. But in Cleveland, Ohio, police would have to build a case on even less. On Saturday, December 15, 1984, Cleveland police were called to the home of Ernestine Campbell. She reported that her brother, Henry, was missing, and she feared for his life because she'd heard he'd been shot and his body hidden in an alley. She told police she'd last seen Henry the night before when he'd left home for a nearby after-hours spot. Officers searched the alley, but didn't find a body. In fact, they didn't find any signs of foul play. They drove through the neighborhood, but didn't see anything unusual. There was no sign of Henry Campbell, and nothing to indicate a violent crime had occurred. Officers canvassed the area, talking to residents who might have seen or heard something the night before. One witness claimed she heard shots and saw men running near the club. Another recalled hearing shots, but couldn't provide any other details. Still others confirmed shots were fired, but nobody admitted seeing anything. Police were frustrated. They had reports of gunfire and a murder, but couldn't find the purported victim. Homicide Detective John Qualey, the lead investigator, recalls the odd circumstances of the case.
Well, usually we're called to the scene of a homicide where we have a victim laying on the street or in a house, but we have a victim. And a lot of times we'll be able to get the weapon used in a crime. With this incident, a murder was reported, we went to the scene, we didn't have a body. We couldn't find the body, we couldn't find any evidence of blood, or we didn't have a weapon. It was kind of starting without anything to work with.
Police needed more information, so they returned to the Campbell house. Ernestine gave them a picture of Henry and more details. She'd heard that some people claimed they'd seen Clarence Barnes shoot her brother in the back. She said Barnes ran the after-hours club in his home and that there was bad blood between him and Henry.
Hi, Miss Richardson. Sorry.
At the station, people who had been at the club that night began coming forward. A woman named Jacqueline Richardson told investigators she saw Campbell at the club and that he argued with Barnes.
Now, do you understand? Not me now. Yeah, it has to be that way. Out of here now.
When Campbell left, Barnes, who had a gun, followed him outside.
Man, you better get off me, man. I told you to stand up.
She said the two men were joined by a third and walked out of her sight. Shortly after that, a woman ran into the club screaming that there'd been a shooting and Henry Campbell was injured.
The other first two, or was
Richardson went outside, where a passerby told her some men were chasing and shooting at another.
all three of
She
them?
said she didn't see anything and returned to the club.
With the gun?
Barnes was already there, asking everyone to leave.
Okay, Mr. Santiago.
As the search continued for evidence of murder, Victor Santiago told police
With
what
those
he
people
knew.
that night?
He was the third man Jacqueline Richardson had described, and his account took up where hers left off.
Give your home. You don't care. You don't care. I don't care who your boys are.
He said he'd seen the two men arguing outside the club and heard Barnes order Campbell to leave. According to Santiago, Campbell caught up with him a few moments later. As they walked down the street, he heard a shot and Campbell fell forward. Santiago said he took cover, then watched Barnes fire 3 more shots at the prostrate Campbell. Police now had 2 eyewitness accounts, but still no evidence of a homicide. Henry Campbell had disappeared, and detectives had 2 eyewitness accounts of murder, but no body and no evidence. Several residents claimed Clarence Barnes bragged that he'd burned Campbell's body and that nobody would ever find him.
Ask a few questions.
Investigators brought Barnes to the station for questioning.
Just take the chair on your left.
He admitted having words with Campbell and asking him to leave, but said he didn't know what happened after that. He denied having anything to do with Campbell's disappearance. When police asked Barnes what he did for a living, he told them he worked at the Animal Resource Center at a local university. That immediately rang a bell in Qualey's mind, and he called Barnes's supervisor.
We asked him if he had an incinerator in the school. And he said, oh, yes. And we asked him how big it was. He said it was big enough to incinerate a steer. We told him then that we were investigating a homicide and that possibly there may be human remains in the incinerator, and asked him if he would seal the room. He did.
The next morning, detectives and a team of forensic investigators went to the Animal Resource Center, believing they might find the remains of Henry Campbell. While the facility director arranged access to the incinerator, the security chief showed them surveillance video from the night Campbell disappeared. It showed Barnes arriving around 3:30 a.m. He backed into the receiving area, which was approximately 15 feet from the incinerator entrance. Police could see him carrying something toward the incinerator room, but couldn't identify what it was.
The picture then jumped away and came back, and the next picture was the incinerator door open and Clarence pushing a cart in there. You could not see what was on the cart, but we knew he was in the incinerator room at that hour.
When investigators saw the incinerator, they knew they were in for a long, complicated task. Dr. Elizabeth Balraj, coroner of Cuyahoga County, recalls the challenge.
There were 100 gallons of cremated ashes containing the remains from various animals, and we had to sift through those and find a very small amount of human bones.
If human bones were to be found at all.
Hold it right there. Where?
The team began the painstaking process of sifting through the incinerator contents. Using a fine mesh screen, they collected fragments of bone and other unburned debris. Though most of the fragments were tiny and charred, some appeared to be human, including a vertebra, mandible, and part of a pelvis. They also found a piece of melted lead. Its size and mass were consistent with a .38 caliber bullet. It was the first solid evidence of murder. Although investigators believed they'd found Henry Campbell, their case would go up in smoke if they couldn't prove it. They turned to Dr. C. Owen Lovejoy, a biological anthropologist at Kent State University and an expert at identifying altered or damaged remains. He applied his skills to making a positive identification from the incomplete and severely damaged bone fragments. Lovejoy concurred with Dr. Balraj that approximately 160 of the recovered bones were human. The next step was determining whether they came from one person and whether that person was Henry Campbell. The process would be complicated by their condition.
Here, the pieces of the puzzle, all of the edges had been frayed, as you will, by the cremation process. And so none of the pieces fit together, and we had to look at them in an isolated state.
After a thorough inventory of the fragments, Lovejoy determined that portions of an entire skeleton were present. No bones were duplicated. That told Lovejoy the remains came from a single individual. But was it Henry Campbell? Next, he would try to establish specifics about the individual. Investigators had recovered part of the pelvis, which is diagnostic for both sex and age. Lovejoy concluded the remains belonged to a male, approximately Henry Campbell's age. While detectives were closer to proving they'd found Campbell, they needed positive identification. But Lovejoy couldn't give them that, not without more to go on.
Whenever we have a candidate individual that we believe the skeletal remains might match, what we do is we try to get a premortem X-ray.
Investigators delivered existing X-rays of Henry Campbell to Dr. Lovejoy. Could they help him prove murder? As Cleveland detectives sought to identify the bones found in the incinerator, Dr. Owen Lovejoy compared post-mortem X-rays and bone fragments with Campbell's radiographs. He focused on the skull, hand, and mandible. One recovered cranial fragment had a BB embedded in it. That matched an X-ray taken when Henry Campbell had accidentally been shot years earlier. Lovejoy also identified shared characteristics between Campbell's other X-rays and corresponding bone fragments. But he found the most compelling correlations in the lower mandible, or jawbone.
And the outline of that jaw, the details of the bone structure, and the details of the root areas where the teeth had been prior to death, all were configured in such a way that they indicated that this was a positive identification.
Since the jaw figured so prominently in that identification, Dr. Elizabeth Robinson, the team's forensic odontologist, reviewed Lovejoy's conclusions. In her opinion, two significant findings bolstered his analysis. The end of the jawbone was flat, a unique defect present in Henry Campbell's jaw. A second anomaly, an area of intense calcification, clinched the identification.
And it was in exactly the same area that it was on the postmortem as on the antemortem. It was also only 5 millimeters in size. In other words, it's the exact same size, same area, and on both X-rays.
With the positive identification, investigators had literally pulled proof of a homicide from the ashes. On December 21st, less than 1 week after Henry Campbell was reported missing, Barnes was officially charged with murder. Based on the evidence, police believe Barnes followed Campbell from his after-hours club, shot him, then hid his body. Later that night, Barnes took Campbell's body to the Animal Resource Center, where he incinerated it. In April of 1985, Clarence Barnes pled guilty to the murder of Henry Campbell. He received 15 years to life for aggravated murder. In Cleveland, police had to sift their case from a pile of ashes. In Maryland, investigators followed a winding trail of clues to capture a killer. Rockville, Maryland, August 10, 1988. 17-year-old Kai Lau returned early from a California vacation at the behest of a family friend to check on his mother, Lisa Tu. He hadn't heard from her in nearly a month, and others told him they hadn't heard from her either. That wasn't like his mother. When he and his mother's friend found no sign of Lisa in the house, they contacted police. They went to the Special Investigations Office at the Montgomery County Police Department to report her missing.
Great, thanks. You're welcome. Detective Turner?
Yes.
Hi.
Kai informed officers that nobody had seen or heard from his mother for a month.
Yes, the reason I called is...
He said that his stepfather, Gregory II, might know more, but he was overseas on business and Kai didn't know how to reach him. Before Gregory left, he told friends that Lisa had flown to San Francisco to visit a friend in the hospital.
For him to not talk to me for so long and all of us...
Kai said it was unusual for his mother to go away without telling anyone except Gregory. Police promised to investigate.
Anything look suspicious up there?
Yeah.
They began by contacting the airlines. Records confirmed that a one-way ticket had been purchased for LL2 on July 13th. The destination was San Francisco via a connecting flight in Los Angeles. The ticket to Los Angeles had been used, but not the one for San Francisco. It appeared Lisa, too, wasn't planning to come back.
This is the one.
That was her right, but the detectives needed to make one more call. They contacted the friend Lisa was supposed to be visiting in San Francisco. She said she hadn't been in the hospital, wasn't expecting Lisa, and hadn't talked to her in months. Now, detectives began to consider whether Lisa, too, intended to disappear, or if there might be a more sinister explanation. Detective Roger Thompson worked the case.
It was not the normal missing person case where we know somebody's missing for a particular reason. They may not contact family members, but we sooner or later find them. This had some mystery to it.
To find out more, detectives spoke to several of Lisa's friends and learned the twos had been married nearly 10 years. It was the second marriage for both, and Kai Lau was Lisa's son from her previous marriage. The twos had enjoyed the good life. Gregory was a successful restaurateur. In fact, one of his restaurants had been a favorite of Washington's elite. But it hadn't lasted. He'd suffered business reversals and lost his restaurants. A commissioned sales job couldn't support the family's affluent lifestyle. Gregory and Lisa argued about money, and their marriage was rocky. Police also learned that Lisa was romantically involved with another man. Police questioned him at his office. He said he spoke to Lisa the afternoon of July 14th, the last day anyone saw or heard from her. He denied knowing anything about a trip to San Francisco and expressed concern over Lisa's sudden disappearance. He indicated Lisa's husband was suspicious about their relationship. When he passed a polygraph test, investigators believed he was telling the truth. Detectives checked out the family's finances and saw indications of serious problems. Gregory was $30,000 in debt. Detective Mike Turner realized too was under a lot of pressure.
Gregory was known to like to gamble, and we determined that he, through interviews with friends, had accrued some debt in gambling that he had not been able to pay. And this was another problem that arose with his relationship with Lisa.
Detectives also learned Lisa Too's bank and charge accounts had been inactive since early July. That didn't make sense if she was alive. They discovered that her husband, who was still unreachable on a business trip, would collect a $200,000 life insurance policy if anything happened to his wife. Detectives began to suspect that the couple's financial woes might spell more than a simple missing persons case. As the investigation continued, Lisa's son was doing a little detective work of his own. Kai Lau found his mother's address book in her bedroom. That was odd because she seldom went anywhere without it. He also noticed that furniture in the house was missing or rearranged. he called Detective Turner.
Hi, Detective Turner.
Kai returned to the police station and met with investigators.
Look, I've also got this withdrawal.
He had found that $44,000 had been withdrawn from a bank account Lisa kept for his education.
Yeah, almost enough for a college tuition.
And that wasn't all.
Like I said, the money.
Kai told police his stepfather's gun was missing, and a sleep sofa had disappeared. He said his mother often slept on it when she and Gregory weren't getting along. Kai also informed detectives that his stepfather, Gregory, was due back from his business trip that evening. By now, investigators had a lot of questions for Gregory, too. They met him at the airport and brought him to the police station.
Officer, have a seat right here.
He was concerned about his wife and was eager to help police. He told them he bought Lisa a plane ticket to San Francisco so she could visit a friend in the hospital. He said he drove her to Dulles International Airport the next day and watched her board the plane.
You wouldn't lie to us, would you, Mr. Two?
Absolutely not.
He claimed she called from Los Angeles and said she was awaiting the flight to San Francisco. He hadn't heard from her since. When they told him Lisa's friend wasn't sick and wasn't expecting her, he seemed surprised.
That's what Lisa told me. Well,
Then he offered another explanation. He claimed his wife was unhappy with her appearance and wanted plastic surgery. He said they'd argued about it in the past. He surmised that might have been the real reason for the trip. Lisa probably made up the story of a sick friend, realizing he wouldn't buy the ticket if he'd known the truth. When detectives inquired about the missing sofa, Two said it was infested with mice and he had it hauled away. He also said he threw the gun away after a well-publicized local incident where a homeowner shot some trespassers. He explained away the $30,000 debt as business and travel expenses. Two begged off further questions, saying he was tired from his long trip. Detectives agreed to continue the interview another day if Two would take a polygraph test. He agreed and promised to return the following Monday.
Sure, you're pretty good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Gregory, too, didn't keep his appointment. He skipped town. To detectives, that seemed the act of a guilty man.
We then felt that the suspicions that the family had, that we had put together since the initiation of the investigation, now had come to fruition, and we were looking probably at a homicide.
Their suspicions about Gregory, too, grew even more when Kai brought them an Air Express letter from California. In it, Gregory claimed he was in Los Angeles looking for Lisa. If he didn't find her there, he planned to continue his search in San Francisco. Investigators considered the letter a self-serving excuse from a guilty man. But believing and proving are two different things. Without Lisa's body, there was no evidence she was dead. They began looking for proof in Gregory's story. Investigators followed up on Kai's tip about his missing college money and enlisted the help of the state's attorney's office. John McCarthy, deputy state attorney in Montgomery County, found Lisa had controlled it.
Gregory, too, cleaned out that account. We got bank photographs from the bank, and clear as day, you could see Gregory, too, stealing the $44,000 from that fund. And within a period of 10 days after he stole it, he had run through that money. It was gone.
Detective Turner re-examined the airline ticket to San Francisco. They learned it was possible for someone to check in, have the ticket marked, but not board the plane. He suspected Gregory, too, had done that, and that Lisa never boarded the plane. They contacted passengers who'd been on the flight. Then, Attorney McCarthy got a real break. A woman called to say she'd been on the plane with her husband and small child. While airborne, the couple took several photographs.
He says, well, I've got some pictures of the seat that Lisa 2 was supposed to be in on that plane from Washington to San Francisco, and she's not in those pictures. And she forwarded me those pictures, and one of the ways we were able to prove conclusively that Lisa was not on that plane that Gregory said she was on was with those pictures.
Detectives wanted to know more about the missing sofa sleeper. They wondered if Lisa's body was inside it when it was hauled away. They tracked down the men who picked it up. They remembered the couch because Gregory tipped them for carrying it out to the truck. They didn't notice anything unusual about it. Investigators traced it to the landfill, but that was a dead end. The sofa had already been ground up and buried. Detectives reasoned that Gregory might have gotten rid of the sofa because it contained proof of Lisa's death. If that were true, there could be other evidence at the residence. They obtained a search warrant to find out. An examination of Gregory's car uncovered incriminating evidence. Clumps of mud, weeds, and twigs were stuck in the undercarriage, indicating the car had been driven off-road. In the trunk, they found a plastic tarp, a carving knife, and a machete.
Mike, come over here. Look.
All of the items were clean, but they could have been used to dispose of a body. Inside the house, detectives found their first physical evidence of foul play. There were droplets of blood on a chair near the spot where the sofa had stood. But investigators suspected more might have been cleaned up. To find out, they processed the area with a Luma light, which makes blood that cannot be seen with the naked eye glow. They discovered blood spatters where the sofa had been, and it displayed a significant pattern.
We know that the couch was open at the time when this all occurred because there was no blood, swiping, or markings underneath the couch. It was a fold-away, opened-up couch, and when they put out the processing, you could see, basically see the outline of the couch opened up as a bed.
Investigators also found signs of smearing, evidence someone had tried to clean up the blood. While they were processing the scene, the phone rang. A car rental agency in Las Vegas was calling for Gregory 2.
Yes.
The car he rented several days before was overdue. It was the brake police were looking for. Now they finally knew where 2 was, but they needed some help in capturing him.
What I would like you to do is, if he calls in about the car in the next few days, or brings the car in, try to stall him, or if he calls in, tell him that you would like to replace the car with another car because this one needs service or whatever reason you can think of, or it's going to be resold, but somehow get him to come to the rental office to get another car.
Hello, my name's Greg.
The plan worked.
Turning my car in? Yes, mister, we have an upgrade for you. Just a minute, please.
Okay.
Yes, sir, I can
On
take you.
Saturday, September 10th, he arrived at the car rental office.
Yes, your car is ready.
It is?
Police arrested him on a fugitive warrant, nearly a month after he disappeared. Detectives Turner and Thompson flew to Las Vegas, where they began retracing 2's activities since he fled Maryland. A matchbook in his hotel room led them to a Chinese restaurant. The manager recognized 2 from a photograph. She told investigators he had applied for a job, saying his wife was dead and he wanted to start a new life. On the job application, he gave his name as Greg Sen. When the detectives returned home with 2, they called in a document examiner at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. They knew Gregory had used aliases. They wanted to confirm whether the handwriting on the job application and other items he wrote matched the bank slip closing Kai Lau's college account. The stolen money would provide the motive for the more serious crime of suspected homicide. After providing known samples of Tu's writing, detectives awaited the results of the document examination. The job application, bank slip, and other documents were compared against Tu's handwriting. In making the comparison, factors such as writing style, speed, and pressure are all studied. Document examiner David Sexton explains.
And it's a combination of those characteristics as well as a combination of recognizable letter formations and that combination of characteristics that are unique to the individual's handwriting.
The writing on the job application, bank slip, and other documents was Gregory Tu's.
Hi, how are you?
Police also consulted a forensic serology investigator about the blood spatters found at the Tu house. He confirmed they were consistent with a high-velocity wound, most likely from a gunshot. Despite all the evidence investigators had collected, their case was still flawed. They needed something solid to prove murder. Without Lisa's body, the only physical evidence they had was blood from the house.
In a divorce settlement.
They had to somehow tie it to the victim.
Kathy, Karen, and Linda, and
they had only one chance, and it was a long shot. To prove Lisa Tu had been murdered, Maryland investigators had to link her to the blood in the house. They hoped forensic DNA analysis could do that, but in 1988, it was still in its infancy. In fact, DNA evidence had only been used in a few trials nationally, none of them murder cases. And the Tu case posed a significant challenge. There were no known samples of Lisa Tu's DNA that could be used for comparison. Without them, it would be difficult to connect Lisa with the blood spatter. The DNA lab needed to perform a reverse paternity test, but this time they would have to work backward. They would determine Lisa's DNA from the blood of her son. Because Kai Lau was a genetic combination of both his parents, scientists could, in theory, forensically subtract his father's DNA from his blood. What remained would be Lisa's DNA profile. Blood was drawn from Kai Lau and from his father in Hong Kong for comparison. By process of elimination, the lab confirmed with 98 to 99% accuracy that blood found at the Tu house was Lisa's. With forensic DNA testing, detectives were able to prove homicide. Investigators believe Gregory Tu was moved to murder by jealousy over his wife's affair and the prospect of solving his financial problems with her life insurance. They pieced together a likely scenario for the night of July 14th. There were indications that the couple had argued, perhaps over the affair, perhaps about money. Desperate and enraged, Gregory Tu pulled his gun from the cabinet and shot Lisa. He then disposed of her body. Despite his protestations of innocence, Gregory Tu was convicted of first-degree murder on November 21st, 1989. He is currently serving a life sentence. Lisa Tu's body has never been found. Once, police had no chance of proving murder without a body. But today, they can make a case on forensic science, even when the victim has disappeared without a trace. Police investigating the disappearance of a woman in Iowa close in on a suspect. But to prove murder, they must identify a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. In Ohio, a grave is unearthed at a construction site. A makeshift coffin and human bones are all investigators have to lead them to a killer. an Illinois state trooper makes a gruesome discovery on the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from the unknown victim's teeth. Some killers believe that they have left no trace of themselves or their victims behind. But forensic scientists have found ways to decipher a killer's calling card by reading clues written in bone. Located on a bend on the Mississippi River, Davenport, Iowa is known as a quiet fishing community. But on March 18, 1983, police were visited by a concerned citizen named Marianne Roth. Marianne was worried about her friend Joyce Clint. They had spoken on the phone earlier in the morning and had made plans to spend the afternoon together. But Joyce hadn't shown up. Joyce had been under a lot of stress in recent weeks. Her marriage was in bad shape, and she and her husband, Jim, were considering divorce.
I don't think so.
Marianne described Joyce as a dedicated mother, not the type to simply run off without a word. For the sake of their son, Bart, Joyce had tried to keep the marriage together. But she wasn't naive. Marianne turned over a tape that Joyce had made several days before her disappearance.
2 days ago.
Joyce had planned to use it as evidence if the divorce went to trial. When investigators played the tape, they quickly realized that Joyce had secretly recorded an incriminating conversation between her and Jim. On it, she confronted her husband about money he was allegedly skimming from his chiropractic business. Responding to the threats, Jim told Joyce that if she exposed him, he would put her head under the pillow, smother her, and then cut her up into little pieces.
You're not going to touch that money. Do you understand?
Though it was savage talk, police are used to hearing these kinds of violent threats from couples facing divorce. To investigators, it was more likely that Joyce had decided to leave town. With the tape safe at Marianne's, she could slip away until the divorce case went to trial. That theory was supported the following day. Joyce's friends discovered her car parked near the airport. Inside the vehicle, police found no evidence of a struggle or any signs of foul play. For investigators, everything suggested that Joyce had gone missing on purpose. Corporal Jerry McCabe of the Davenport Police Department worked the investigation.
It first looked like a possible family argument where she may have taken off and hadn't spoken to anybody in a while.
But the persistence of Joyce Clint's friends convinced police to look into the disappearance. They paid a visit to Jim Clint. Jim readily admitted that he and Joyce had fought on the morning of the 18th. He had stormed out and gone to the marina where he kept his boat in order to cool off. Because of rising floodwaters, he decided not to go out on the river. He secured his boat and returned home. By that time, he said Joyce was gone, along with a closet full of clothes and $4,000 of his money. Investigators checked on his alibi with a visit to the marina.
Did you
you see him on March 18th?
A restaurant manager confirmed that she saw Clint that morning, around 11 a.m. She saw Clint loading filled trash bags onto his boat. She said he left the dock in his boat, returned sometime later, and then went out again. This eyewitness account contradicted Jim's alibi. Detectives decided to take a closer look into Jim Clint's background. Jim Clint's drinking and philandering were well known in the small community of Davenport. Police learned that he had been having a blatant affair with one of his patients. Hoping to learn more, investigators tracked the woman down. She told investigators that on the day of Joyce's disappearance, Jim had invited her over around noon. He had a surprise. He said that Joyce agreed to a divorce and had left town. Now they could finally be together. Joyce's threats to expose Jim's alleged embezzling, coupled with the information about his extramarital affair, gave investigators reason to believe that Jim Clint had motive to kill his wife. But without any hard evidence that a crime had been committed, it was still just speculation. But on April 15th, nearly a month after Joyce's disappearance, the Mississippi River would offer a gruesome clue. Several miles south of Davenport, two fishermen noticed something floating in the river. As they got closer, they could see that it was the remains of something human. They fled the scene and called 911. Investigators responded to the riverbank and pulled the body from the water. It was a female torso, severed just above the navel and just below the tops of the thighs. For even the most seasoned detectives, the scene was difficult to comprehend. A limited autopsy determined that the victim was a Caucasian woman who'd been in the water anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. The cut marks appeared to have been made by a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain. Mindful of the violent threats Jim had made on the tape, investigators believed they had found Joyce Clint. But they were a long way from proving murder. To make their case, they would first have to identify the remains. And that wouldn't be easy. Investigators turned to renowned forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow at the University of Oklahoma. His approach is simple.
And basically what we try to do is look at the skeleton, all 200 bones and 32 teeth, and we're trying to answer two questions primarily. Who is this person? Who was this person? And how did they die?
Snow's expertise allows him to develop a profile from the barest of bones. Even with only the torso to work with, Snow could tell a lot about the victim. To determine her age, he studied the area of the pelvis known as the pubic symphysis.
The surfaces of this joint undergo some fairly regular changes with age. In younger people, there's a system of strong grooves, you might say, and ridges. They gradually begin to disappear in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so on, till finally you wind up with a rather flat, featureless surface.
Based on the ridge detail in the victim's pelvis, Snow believed the victim was between 26 and 34 years old. Next, he studied the dimensions of the remaining leg and hip bones and calculated that she was between 5 feet and 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed between 125 and 140 pounds. Even though Joyce Clint fit those measurements, police soon learned that so did dozens of other missing women. Until investigators could narrow down their pool of possible victims, the identity of the severed torso would remain a mystery. Police in Davenport, Iowa struggled with two cases: the disappearance of Joyce Clint and the discovery of a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. They believed the cases were connected, and they believed Joyce's husband, Jim, was responsible. But until they could positively identify the remains, they couldn't prove murder. Using the description of the victim supplied by forensic anthropologist Dr. Clyde Snow, Davenport Police Lieutenant Dennis Kern began a computerized search of all missing women in the region. The computer returned the names of 17 missing women. Detectives were able to eliminate 8 of the women since they had disappeared after the torso was found. 2 of the women were ultimately found, and another 3 didn't match the physical description.
When we were finished with 4 people, one of whom was Joyce Clint.
With the investigation taking on a more narrow focus, investigators decided to pay another visit to Jim Clint. They returned to his home, this time with a search warrant. In his garage, they found what they were looking for: a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain, the same width as the cut marks on the body. Technicians processed the chainsaw with indicator fluid that turns pink in the presence of blood. They covered every square inch of the saw. Not a single drop of blood or tissue could be found. Either Jim Clint was smarter than investigators had imagined, or the torso found in the river was not Joyce Clint. There was only one way to be sure. Police had to find a way to positively identify the remains. Though DNA analysis hadn't yet been developed in 1983, there were new ways of identifying an individual from genetic markers in blood enzymes. Blood samples were subpoenaed from Jim Clint and his son Bart. A comparison with the blood from the victim showed a genetic consistency with Bart. Further tests of Joyce Clint's parents' blood also showed consistent patterns. The genetic information on its own was not enough to establish identity. But out of the 4 unaccounted for women, only Joyce Clint matched both the physical description as described by Dr. Snow and the genetic description provided by the blood tests. The conclusion was unmistakable.
Looking at the women that met these physical characteristics, what of those 4, what were the odds that any one of them would have matched the genetic picture? And the odds were infinitesimal.
The torso belonged to Joyce Clint. And all of the evidence pointed to her husband Jim as the killer.
There was a division of monies, properties, and that he was going to lose. He was going to have a lot of things taken away from him because she was done, fed up, ready to go. And the girlfriend motive was there. There were so many that he thought that were in his way of a happier life, you know.
Jim was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. Police believe that Jim executed his plan on the morning of March 18th. After murdering Joyce in their home, he drove her remains to a remote spot where he dismembered her with a chainsaw. He used his boat to dispose of the body parts and the saw. He then placed her car near the airport to throw investigators off his trail. Though he maintained his innocence through the trial, the jury found Jim Clint guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Jim Clint thought that dismemberment would keep himself and his victim from ever being identified. In Ohio, a killer tried to avoid prosecution by keeping his horrible secret buried deep in the ground. On June 20th, 1990, in the small northern Ohio town of Elyria, a construction worker uncovered a long-buried secret. His bulldozer struck a hard object, resting several feet beneath the ground. It appeared to be a wooden box. As he walked closer to the find, he was overwhelmed by a horrible odor. He realized he had unearthed a makeshift grave. He called police. Lieutenant Dan Jekyll of the Elyria Police Department was immediately dispatched to the site. Due to the construction, the scene had already been compromised.
But we were concerned about the evidence. The evidence was being pushed down by the bulldozer. There are bits of pieces in wood that might have been carried 25, 30, 40 yards away, besides the initial scene that we had to protect.
That wasn't their only problem. Rain clouds threatened to destroy possible trace evidence. With the site now exposed, they would only have this one chance to get what they needed. To preserve any potential findings, investigators had to treat the scene like an archaeological dig, sifting through the earth for stray bullets, jewelry, or other identification with deliberate precision. The initial search of the construction site turned up no clues to tell investigators the identity of the victim. After several hours, the badly decomposed body, wrapped in garbage bags, was hand-dug from the grave. Despite their continued efforts, no additional evidence or identification was found. Police needed to know who was in the grave before they could figure out how he or she got there. For help, investigators called on distinguished anthropology professor Dr. Owen Lovejoy at Kent State University.
I went out and examined the body and collected some materials, the purpose of which was to provide as many details about that individual in life as I could.
From the condition of the pelvis, examiners were able to determine that the body was a female, somewhere around 28 to 30 years old. An examination into the shape and proportions of the skull told them that the victim was Caucasian. Dr. Lovejoy measured the thigh and arm bones and factored them into an equation to determine the victim's height. She was surprisingly tall, almost 6 feet. Dr. Lovejoy had provided investigators with their first glimpse of how the victim appeared alive. It was now up to them to discover her identity. Detectives started by looking into unsolved missing persons cases. But in all of those cases, none of the missing women fit the description of the buried body.
I think she's the county jail.
Investigators turned their attention to the only other piece of evidence. Though it seemed like a long shot, they called in a draftsman to measure the fractured pieces of the makeshift coffin and render a detailed illustration of it. Investigators turned the illustration over to the local paper, along with the description of the unidentified woman. Days later, a woman called to say that she thought she recognized the makeshift coffin. The woman remembered admiring the piece in her friend Sandra Stuller's apartment.
Again, we talked on the phone.
She told police it had been over 3 years since Sandra disappeared without a goodbye. She wasn't able to offer any speculation on what happened to her old friend, but she was able to give police a valuable piece of information. Like the woman found at the construction site, Sandra Stuller was 6 feet tall. Though still unsure that they'd identified their victim, it was the investigators' only lead. Detectives tracked down an aunt and uncle of Sandra's living in the area. Like the witness who identified the chest, they hadn't seen their niece in the past 3 years. The relatives said that shortly before they lost touch, Sandra had rekindled a relationship with her ex-husband, Doug Hartman. He had been a loving and supportive husband at first, but as the years went by, he grew abusive. Sandra eventually left him, but Doug wanted her back, and against the wishes of her relatives, she decided to give him another chance.
And the family told Sandra, this is a bad move. You should not go back to Douglas Hartman. In fact, if you decide to do that, you're no longer part of this family.
But Sandra stuck with Doug, and the family severed ties.
Well, I appreciate it. If you hear from her...
They hadn't heard from her since. Now, investigators needed to pick up the story where the aunt and uncle's account left off. They tracked down the manager of Sandra's last known apartment, where she lived just before she disappeared in 1987.
She had paid rent in full. But
Apparently, the reunion with Doug had been short-lived. Sandra had been living alone at the time.
and she wasn't there.
The manager remembered that the circumstances surrounding Sandra's departure were strange. In December of 1987, she saw a man moving Sandra's belongings out of the apartment and into a rental truck. The manager had not seen the man before. She didn't see Sandra that day or ever again. Sandra had abandoned her apartment without a word. Investigators suspected the man moving Sandra's things was Doug Hartman. To prove that theory, they went to the truck rental agency. They pored over hundreds of receipts from 3 years before.
That's it.
On one of the receipts from December of 1987, they found what they came for.
Do you happen to remember anything about this gentleman?
The name of Sandra's ex-husband, Doug Hartman.
Okay. I appreciate it.
It was time to question Doug, but there was no record of him living in town. But detectives managed to find a relative still in the area. He told police he hadn't heard from Doug since he had gone to live with his grandmother in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a few years back. Detectives wondered what had prompted Doug to leave town.
And if you hear from him or think of anything else.
But their theories would be meaningless until they could prove that the buried remains belonged to Sandra Stuller. Detectives in Elyria, Ohio, believed that the body and the makeshift coffin unearthed at a construction site belonged to Sandra Stuller. And they suspected that her ex-husband, Doug Hartman, had put her there. Word of the investigation into Sandra Stuller's whereabouts spread quickly. A local bank manager contacted detectives. He too had been searching for Sandra. She had stopped paying rent on a security deposit box. Investigators obtained a search warrant. The contents of the box included Sandra's divorce decree, her will, and some diamond and gold jewelry. Not the kind of valuable items a person would carelessly abandon, unless, as Detective Dan Jekyll thought, they had no choice.
And that reinforced my idea that the person that we uncovered on Shadden Road was in fact Sandra Stuller, but I had to prove it.
Detectives were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. Desperate for any information, they plugged Sandra's Social Security number into a law enforcement database. They got a hit. Sandra had been in a car accident shortly before she disappeared. The report mentioned that she had been taken to the hospital for treatment, which included X-rays. It was the break detectives were looking for.
When I found out that there was a chest X-ray taken, I knew that this would help the case. And when I contacted Dr. Lovejoy, he told me if I can get that original X-ray, there's a real good chance that he could identify the remains.
Investigators visited the hospital and subpoenaed Sandra Stuller's X-rays. Now that they had a source of comparison, they turned back to the expertise of forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Lovejoy.
Initially, when we looked at her skeleton and compared it to these chest films, we realized that there were a number of very special characters that were very rare. One of these was the fact that she only had 11 ribs, when a normal individual usually has 12. That's a fairly rare abnormality. Another is that the individual had suffered a fracture of her right clavicle. And so these were two characters that matched both the bones that we had.
It was powerful evidence, but not conclusive. Lovejoy next had to examine the very fine details preserved inside the bone. There, small features called trabecula are as unique as the characteristics of a fingerprint. To make the comparison, Dr. Lovejoy began by re-X-raying the bones with a powerful machine called a faxitron that produces high-resolution images of bone. That completed, he then compared the trabecula one by one.
We did this in this particular case and found that they were in fact an exact match, so that there was no question that these were the remains of Sandra Stoller.
The victim had finally been identified. Investigators now needed to establish and prove motive in her death. Looking through her financial records, they believed they found their answer. Prior to her disappearance, Sandra had inherited over $100,000 when her mother died. She had set up a $50,000 mutual fund and had been living off the interest. But a letter in the file, signed by Sandra after she had already been murdered, requested that her assets be transferred to an account in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That account was in the name of Doug Hartman. Sandra Stoller had been murdered for her money.
And through bank records and subpoenas, I was able to track that $51,000 into Douglas Hartman's own personal checking account. I did have a motive then.
Doug was brought back to Ohio for questioning. When investigators confronted him with all of the evidence, he began to crumble. He confessed to killing her, but claimed that it had been an accident. Police believed otherwise. After murdering Sandra and burying her body, Doug fled to Virginia, where he had all of her assets transferred into his bank account. It took a jury less than 6 hours to find Doug Hartman guilty of aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and theft. He was sentenced to life in prison. Though Sandra Stoller's body had been buried for more than 3 years, investigators were able to solve her murder from the bare bones. In Illinois, investigators had even less to work with. Stretching from Chicago to Springfield, I-55 is one of the most heavily traveled highways in Illinois. State troopers regularly cruise its length, hunting down speeders. But on March 10th, 1986, it was not a speeder that caught the troopers' attention. Something was burning on the side of the road. As the officer approached, he thought it was a mannequin that had been set on fire. But as he got closer, he realized it was something far more disturbing. It was the charred mass of a human body. After extinguishing the blaze, the trooper called for backup. The following morning, evidence technicians from the Illinois Division of Criminal Investigations began processing the area for clues. The scene offered little indication as to who could have committed this brutal act. The only potential evidence was a set of tire tracks imprinted in the soil. But on a well-traveled highway, they could have belonged to anyone. Technicians made a plaster mold of the tread marks in the hopes a suspect would emerge and could then be placed at the scene. But finding a suspect would be difficult, if not impossible, until detectives could identify the remains. At autopsy, the examiner concluded the female victim had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The only identifying features that survived the fire were her teeth. A pearl necklace and a ring bearing the letter E were removed from the victim. Based on her petite stature and slender hip dimensions, the examiner believed the victim to be between 18 and 25 years old, and possibly Hispanic. For Lieutenant Carlos Hevia of the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations, the information wasn't a lot to go on.
The first order of business is identify who's the victim. In this particular case, we had difficulty because of the fact that we didn't have a photograph to go around when we were doing canvassing.
Nonetheless, investigators began questioning people in the neighborhoods around the scene of the fire. One clerk at a nearby gas station remembered selling a can of gasoline the night before. He helped investigators come up with a composite. The sketch was publicized, but no one came forward to name the suspect. Investigators launched a statewide media campaign. A flood of tips came in, but after 2 weeks, detectives still couldn't match the remains to any missing persons cases. With their whole case hinging on identification, investigators sought help from the state's Forensic Anthropology Department. After taking a life-sized X-ray of the victim's skull, they built a three-dimensional model, sculpting a face in modeling clay. It might not be an identical match, but hopefully it would bring about a spark of recognition from the public. Photographs of the reconstructed head and the victim's ring were sent to local press. But again, no one came forward to identify the young woman. Now, several weeks after the murder, chances of solving the case were dwindling away. A methodical killer still walked the streets. After several weeks, investigators were no closer to solving the brutal murder of an unidentified woman whose body had been set on fire and left burning on the side of an Illinois highway. Desperate to identify the remains, investigators sent the victim's skull and teeth to Dr. Stephen Smith, a consultant in forensic dentistry.
In the worst of circumstances, the teeth pretty well survive. And so because of that, we become very useful for the uniqueness of the human dentition. We can find the uniquenesses that everybody has in their dentition. And that's enough to separate us from one human being to another.
The arch of the jaw suggested that the victim was most likely Asian, not Hispanic. After studying the general anatomy, Dr. Smith examined each individual tooth.
This would be the temporary cement that would indicate that this person is probably going to be going back to the dentist. And I see some bone loss in this area. This would indicate periodontal disease, and that the person probably was possibly seeing a periodontist.
This kind of dental history gave Dr. Smith new insight into the victim's age.
As I looked at this information and as I came to my independent evaluation, I thought this person had to be at least in their 40s. 38 to 40, maybe 42, 43, somewhere like that, but not more than a 5-year difference.
Dr. Smith's detailed analysis had exposed a critical flaw in the original description of the victim. She couldn't have been between the ages of 18 and 25 as previously thought. He showed that she was some 20 years older than that.
In this particular case, we were scrambling because we were chasing an 18 to 25-year-old missing person that was not our victim. So when they came up with that, it was like somebody just opened a door, you know.
Now, almost 2 months after the burning body had been found, detectives went back to the statewide police computer network and modified the victim's description. The new findings paid off. Within hours of modifying their search, investigators received a call from nearby DuPage County Sheriff's Department. They had a missing persons case that matched the new description. Illinois State Police met with DuPage County Sheriffs to discuss the case. They learned Erlinda Anderson was a 43-year-old housewife reported missing by her sister in early March. Born in the Philippines, she'd come to the United States to marry her husband, William. The fact that this victim's name began with the letter E led investigators to believe they were on the right track.
All right, thanks very much.
Deputies told investigators that they had met with William Anderson shortly after his wife was reported missing. He was questioned about his wife and their marriage. It hadn't been a traditional courtship. During the interview, Anderson admitted that he'd met Erlinda through a classified ad. She was looking for an American husband. He was looking for companionship. The relationship started well, Anderson said. She seemed very happy with the comforts of middle-class America. But as the marriage wore on, Erlinda became very homesick. He insisted Erlinda wasn't missing. In fact, he'd seen her board a plane bound for the Philippines in early March. Following up on William Anderson's story, DuPage County investigators questioned Erlinda's friends. They confirmed that Erlinda had been unhappy with her life in the U.S., mostly because of her marriage to William. And she had been longing to return home. But it was strange that they hadn't heard from their friend in months. William Anderson's inconsistent story, coupled with Dr. Smith's forensic analysis, led investigators to now believe the victim found burning on the side of the road was Erlinda Anderson. And that would make her husband the leading suspect in her murder. But so far, there was no evidence to prove it. Investigators from the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations were getting closer to identifying charred remains found along a highway. They believed the victim was 43-year-old Erlinda Anderson. But until they could be sure, police wouldn't be able to make a case against the prime suspect, her husband, William. With only the victim's teeth to work with, investigators subpoenaed Erlinda's dental records. They were sent to forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith for comparison. While awaiting the results of his examination, detectives began scrutinizing William Anderson's alibi. He had claimed that he had seen Erlinda board a plane bound for the Philippines. Investigators paid a visit to the airlines. Anderson had in fact purchased a ticket to Manila in Erlinda's name. But a week before her body was found, records showed that William Anderson cashed in the ticket. Erlinda never boarded a plane to the Philippines.
Okay, you got time?
William Anderson had been caught in a blatant lie. But if Anderson had killed his wife, the question now before investigators was why. A further background check revealed that Erlinda had been William's 5th wife. Based on a search of Anderson's phone records, they learned that he probably didn't intend her to be his last. Many of the bills reflected calls to one of Anderson's female co-workers. The woman, who was married, reluctantly admitted that she and Anderson had been having an affair. Anderson complained to her that Erlinda was constantly spending his money, always sending gifts to her friends and family in the Philippines. The day after the body was found, William took her out for a romantic dinner. He told her to leave her husband and marry him instead.
She questioned Anderson about, you know, what about your wife? And Anderson told her, don't worry about my wife, she's not coming back.
The case was now in the hands of forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith. When making an identification, Smith superimposes the living dental records with the x-rays made after death.
On this case here, I can take and move it around, and all of a sudden I see a clear picture. It was fuzzy, now it's totally clear. It means that the one film overlays the other one perfectly. In myself, if I'm asked, is this a match, I could say yes. I would be assured, looking at this film, that this film matches that film, and I could say that this dentition belongs to that remains.
After months of frustration, the burned body had finally been identified as Erlinda Anderson. And with a new romance brewing, William Anderson had motive to get rid of her. Still lacking physical evidence linking him to the murder, investigators paid him another visit. They asked him to follow them to the police station for further questioning. While police began their interrogation, a warrant was obtained to search Anderson's car. Though the tire treads did not match those found at the crime scene, the trunk and the items inside it were splattered with red stains. Indicator tests confirmed the presence of human blood on a windbreaker and a tire iron. The blood was too deteriorated to make a detailed comparison, but it was one more piece of incriminating evidence. The results of the examination were brought up to police. William Anderson was placed under arrest. Investigators believe that Anderson used the tire iron to beat Erlinda in the head. After she was dead, he drove her body down Interstate 55. He doused her body in gasoline, thinking that all his problems would burn away in the ensuing fire. Without the insights of forensic dentistry, he might have gotten away without a trace. A jury found William Anderson guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Some killers are determined to keep the identity of their victims a secret. When they are successful, their deeds threaten to go unpunished. But forensic scientists can breathe life into a dying investigation and find justice written in bone.